This is In the Loop. I'm Christian Bryant. The news might not be the most laid back and carefree thing you'll watch today, but I'll try to throw a few smiles between hard news items for balance. Here's what we got for y'all. From tear gas to rubber bullets, over the last year, police use of so-called less lethal munitions has skyrocketed, but those new tools aren't without their risks. Plus, COVID has strained the healthcare system, exposing nursing shortages and delaying graduations for new nurses who are much needed. But first, here's what you need to know right now. There may be just over a week left in President Donald Trump's term, but that's not stopping many lawmakers from trying to get him out of office even sooner after the president rallied a violent mob that attacked the Capitol last week. This evening, the House voted to formally call on Vice President Mike Pence to strip Trump of his duties by invoking the 25th Amendment. Reports suggest it's unlikely Pence will act, which is why House Democrats are already preparing Plan B. On Wednesday, they plan to vote on one article of impeachment, charging the president with inciting violence against the government of the United States. We haven't heard much from Trump since he was banned from Twitter. As the president headed to the Texas border today, he made his first public comments since the deadly riots last week.
If you read my speech, and many people have done it, and I've seen it both in the papers and in the media, on television, it's been analyzed, and people thought that what I said was totally appropriate.
For context, here's what the president said to a group of people who later stormed the Capitol.
We fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength. We will not let them silence your voices. We're not going to let it happen. Not going to let it happen.
As the nation prepares to welcome its next president, there are lingering concerns about the deadly attacks that happened at the Capitol last Wednesday and what's to come next week. The big question: how to secure Joe Biden's inauguration. It's set to be held on the same risers that pro-Trump rioters overtook last week. According to the New York Times, at least 16 groups, some of them known to regularly carry weapons, have already registered to stage protests in Washington. On Monday, Chad Wolf, the acting Secretary of Homeland Security, resigned. Before he left, Wolf announced enhanced security measures in D.C. are set to begin Wednesday. Meanwhile, the National Guard plans to deploy a total of 10,000 troops for next Wednesday. For comparison, just 340 National Guard members had been activated ahead of last week's riots. In preparation, the National Park Service also closed the Washington Monument and the grounds of the Capitol. DC's mayor has requested an emergency declaration in the city, which the president approved. She's also asking the Trump administration to cancel public gathering permits until the 24th.
Our goals right now are to encourage Americans to participate virtually and to protect the District of Columbia from a repeat of the violent insurrection experienced at the Capitol and its grounds on January the 6th.
From wasted doses to backed up shipments, the early distribution and administration of COVID-19 vaccines has gone less than smoothly across the country. Today, the Trump administration announced changes to its current plan that could help. The most significant move: many more vaccines will be made available. The administration will no longer hold back half the doses, a plan initially proposed by the incoming Biden administration. Health officials say an exclusive focus on nursing homes and healthcare workers, even young ones, was another factor slowing down the rollout. Today, the Trump administration issued new recommendations making everyone 65 years old and above eligible to get the vaccine. Anyone at least 16 years old with a pre-existing health condition should also be considered. Of course, those are just guidelines. At the end of the day, it's up to the individual states to decide what to implement. Alaska, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and Ohio have already begun vaccinating anyone 65 and older. Meanwhile, New York is ramping up its efforts to get the vaccine to more people. The governor announced 24/7 vaccine centers in each of its 5 boroughs. The shots will also be offered in schools and post offices. In California, baseball stadiums, a fairground, and Disneyland will be turned into mass vaccination sites. Over the last year, U.S. law enforcement has used a range of less lethal munitions like tear gas or rubber bullets to control crowds of civilians. Some of those tactics were used on rioters who stormed the Capitol last week, but these munitions were used in full force against protesters for racial justice last summer. Our award-winning Newsy Bellingcat series takes a closer look at how less lethal munitions have been used and how the name isn't always fitting considering the damage they can cause.
Protests against police brutality have swept across the United States for months now. Many of them are ongoing. Along with those protests came unprecedented use of what are known as less lethal munitions by police against US civilians. These are devices like tear gas, rubber bullets, or flashbangs. And while the less lethal munitions' purpose is to disperse protesters, in the US and abroad we've seen how they can lead to injury and even death when deployed in force. Less lethal munitions, or LLMs, have become ubiquitous in policing around the world. In places like Iraq or Chile, they've been used to not only disperse protesters, but also to maim and kill. In the US, particularly over the past few months, the use of LLMs has resulted in countless injuries to both protesters and journalists alike. And for those who are just showing up to cover or participate in protests where munitions like tear gas are used, there's also the question of what long-term health impacts they'll have.
People were not meant to be exposed to as much tear gas as they are in Portland. I would say maybe the only part of the world that is currently getting as much tear gas exposure would be like Palestine and Hong Kong.
This is Robert Evans, an investigative journalist with Bellingcat. He's been covering ongoing protests in Portland since they started and has had first-hand experience with many of the less lethal munitions being used by both police in Portland and around the United States. By far, the largest producer of less lethal munitions used in the United States is a company called Defense Technology. Their brand can be found on most of the LLM remnants found after protests, including gas canisters and impact munitions. To give an example of how many of these kinds of munitions are used by police in the United States, we can look at some numbers from the protests in Denver following the death of George Floyd. The Denver Police Department tripled its inventory of Defense Technology gas and smoke grenades between May 29th and June 1st. It also purchased 300 Defense Technology Stinger rubber ball grenades during the protests when it only had 6 before. As these less lethal munitions are put into the hands of more law enforcement agencies, questions around their use will only grow. Understanding the risks of less lethal munitions could lead to more effective and safer means of crowd control.
We won't really know the long-term effects of all of this stuff for quite some time, nor will we know the effects of it kind of getting washed into the water table here. It's never really been used on this scale, at least not in the United States, and so people haven't done much research into the long-term effects.
When you're back, we'll make a case for why Alabama coach Nick Saban should probably start all over with a program like Wyoming or something. No shade to the Cowboy State.
As the coronavirus has quickly spread across the
A
world,
freeze on travel has the potential to reshape why people fly.
This halt in traditional entertainment highlights how viewers and creators are coping together.
healthcare systems in the U.S. will need 3.5 billion masks.
The economic damage looks very different on either side of the Atlantic.
There are only about 117,000 beds nationwide.
When can we get back to normal?
This next section is for all the people who scoff at their weekly screen time reports because we already know we've been on Twitter too much. Here's what's trending, folks. The Alabama Crimson Tide beat the Ohio State Buckeyes in the college football national championship game Monday night 52-24. Alabama was led by playmaking from Heisman Trophy winning receiver Devontae Smith and quarterback Mac Jones, who had 5 touchdowns and 464 passing yards. This championship was Nick Saban's 6th with Alabama and 7th overall, which, is it still fun for him? It's hard to say which was more impressive though, the gameplay from Alabama or the fact that despite canceled games and COVID outbreaks, there was a championship game in the first place. Unfortunately, Alabama also trended because of the potential tide of COVID cases that could sweep through Tuscaloosa following the close-quarter celebrations that took place after the win. As a reminder, it's been less than a week since the US saw the highest number of COVID deaths in a single day. Alabama so far has experienced more than 400,000 cases and more than 5,000 deaths. COVID really don't give a damn if your team won. Deutsche Bank is trending after a New York Times report said Germany's largest bank would no longer do business with President Trump or his company. Deutsche Bank has been Trump's biggest lender for decades and helped fund his golf courses and hotels. Trump currently owes the bank more than $300 million. While representatives from the German bank have not said anything publicly about the move, Signature Bank, a US bank that has worked with the Trumps, offered up their reasoning for closing Trump's personal accounts. We witnessed the President of the United States encouraging the rioters and refraining from calling in the National Guard to protect the Congress in its performance of duty. The bank also called for Trump to resign. Several other companies have distanced themselves from the president en masse after his supporters stormed the Capitol building in an attempt to overturn election results. I've joked once or twice about finishing Netflix, and sometimes it felt that way. But for the folks who've binged so much that there's very little you haven't seen, this next tidbit is going to pique your interest. Netflix just released their 2021 film slate, and it includes 70 movies, giving subscribers at least one new movie every week this year. And this might not even be a full list, since Netflix is likely to acquire new films during the year. Directorial debuts from both Halle Berry and Lin-Manuel Miranda are included on the 2021 film slate. Also on the slate is Malcolm and Marie, starring Zendaya and John David Washington, which, go ahead and sign me up for it. This is the first time that Netflix has ever released their slate of films at one time, and it might be key in reminding subscribers why they stick with Netflix as streaming competition grows in response to the pandemic. New binging material might be the most exciting announcement of 2021 so far, seeing that I might be inside most of this year too. The coronavirus pandemic has strained our nation's healthcare system, and while there have been nursing shortages, the pandemic has also delayed nursing students from graduating or attending school, ultimately holding up the process of them helping out when they're most needed. Newsy's Kat Sandoval explains.
I was planning on getting out there and helping in December, but because my graduation was delayed, they don't have that new batch of nurses.
Nursing student Allie Anchuk will graduate in May, 5 months later than expected, because the coronavirus has impacted the capacity for hospitals and nursing homes to train students.
When the pandemic hit, we were about to go to clinicals for that semester, and all the local hospitals shut things down, so we weren't able to go.
Students are required to do in-person clinicals, real-world experience with veteran nurses and actual patients.
The entire pipeline of nursing education is impacted when hospitals say we can't take students.
California State University East Bay canceled nursing admissions for this spring and fall, making room for former students to catch up with their clinicals safely.
When nurses are working with students, that is time taken away from patients. Of course, it's educating the next generation, but when we have a crisis like we have now with the pandemic, we also know that PPE is running low, so can we ethically have students in clinical placements when they're not protected?
Some schools are partially substituting in-person clinicals virtually or in simulations, so students can graduate on time. But some students don't feel as comfortable with this.
It's definitely scary, but I would say that I'm lucky that this last semester is heavily clinically dependent, and luckily when we graduate, nursing, your first nursing job is considered a residency.
Not all nursing schools have delayed graduations or closed admissions, but one thing is clear: the coronavirus has increased the demand for nurses, and we're not keeping up. Even before the pandemic hit, the American Academic Colleges of Nursing predicted 16 states will experience nursing shortages in 2025. Factors include an aging baby boomer population, high turnover rates, and a lack of nursing educators.
I'm going to retire in June. I'm 70 years old. And we have a lot of nursing faculty who are hanging in there, continuing to teach, simply because there isn't a doctorally prepared faculty member available to take their place.
A lack of nurses coming into the workforce could mean lower nurse-to-patient care ratios, which can decrease quality care and lead to worker burnout. For Newsy, I'm Kat Sandoval.
Native tribes have something else at stake during this pandemic: cultural preservation. There are myriad challenges to distributing and administering the COVID-19 vaccines, and for some communities, there's a time limit to all of this. Native American tribes are working quickly to vaccinate native language speakers to preserve their cultural history and address a lack of vaccine confidence. Newsy's Meg Hilling spoke to tribal leaders on how they're tackling this challenge.
We've already lost 30 fluent speakers to COVID.
Tribes such as the Cherokee and Navajo Nation say they're working to quickly vaccinate native language speakers in an effort to preserve crucial ties to their heritage.
When you lose a fluent speaker, you lose a life and you lose really a national treasure.
A lot of those individuals in the 65 and over category know the history, know the culture, know our way of life teaching, and of course our language.
By vaccinating as many of their 2,000 native speakers as possible, Principal Chief of the Cherokee Nation, Chuck Hoskin Jr., says his tribe is able to protect their language and dispel mistrust in the vaccines.
I think there's something about the position that they hold in people's hearts and people's minds that I think probably did more to build confidence than any elected official.
Education on the virus and vaccines has remained a top priority for tribal governments. These efforts include live streaming vaccinations, bi-weekly town halls, and operating call centers to schedule vaccinations and answer questions.
We want the Navajo people to be informed on the vaccine.
The biggest concern on the horizon now: running out of vaccines to give.
But the fact that people keep asking me directly or indirectly, when is it my turn? That's what we want. We want our citizens to be eager to get this vaccine. We'll have some explaining to do to our citizens if we don't have the vaccine.
Not everybody wants it, of course, but there is some interest, a lot of interest in taking the vaccine.
Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez says more than 50% of the vaccine doses his tribe has received so far have been administered, a far faster rollout than many states, and a welcome sight for a community that has suffered disproportionately at the hands of this pandemic. Nez says any state that chooses to let vaccines sit in freezers should send them his way instead.
And if their people are not wanting to get that vaccine, then Navajo Nation is willing to take those vaccines so we can get our people covered and safe from this virus because of what we've gone through for these 10 months.
For Newsy, I'm Meg Hilling.
If you haven't done so already, feel free to reach out to us on Twitter using the hashtag NewsyInTheLoop. For $0 a day, you can make a difference in my life and maybe yours by tweeting me absolute nonsense. Now might be a good time to send leftover good tidings and cheer to your HR person because they'll likely be fielding a ton of questions about vaccines as the rollout continues. Many employees are wondering what this will mean for work or school and whether getting a vaccine will be mandated. National reporter Stephanie Stone tells us about how HR professionals are navigating this uncharted terrain.
We have had our busiest year yet with all of the COVID questions that have come along.
Amber Clayton is the director of the Knowledge Center at SHRM, or the Society for Human Resource Management. Basically, they help the HR people help you.
We get about 65,000 questions a year, and we've actually gotten a number of questions with regards to the vaccination.
Clayton says as COVID vaccines are finally distributed, many are wondering what that means at work and at school.
Whether or not they can require vaccinations for their employees, and if they do require it, what happens if an employer refuses to get the vaccine? We've had questions around the liability if an employer actually administers the vaccine.
And if it is required, where should an employee get it, and what policies should be in place?
It's going to depend on the industry primarily, and of course, if there are any state or local laws as well. So they have to look to that as well.
What if you were to mandate it and the employee then refuses? Then what?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it depends on the circumstances. So, for example, if an employee refuses because they have a disability or they have a sincerely held religious belief, then an employer may have to make a reasonable accommodation absent undue hardship.
We understand that those people who do take this very seriously and do want to be vaccinated may not feel comfortable with unvaccinated people in the office. So obviously these are some questions we're going to have to answer, probably sooner rather than later.
Valerie Keels sits on a SHRM panel that helps offer vaccine guidance, among other things. She's in a good position to do so, given her job with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a global nonprofit that helps provide vaccines to developing countries.
My organization is involved with vaccines. We do support, the vaccine and support efforts to make sure that employees are vaccinated. Obviously, we can't require that, legally, but we do support it.
SHRM says it's likely that most employees will be encouraged, not mandated. If it is required, then the employer probably will have to pay for it and help employees get it.
The EEOC has actually considered the pandemic a direct threat. And so, employers may face challenges in employees leaving the organization. If they do decide to mandate the vaccines, they could potentially lose employees as a result of that.
Or on the flip side, businesses may have a hard time recruiting employees or keeping them if they don't feel safe at work amongst those who choose not to vaccinate. The good news is we've all adjusted to remote employment.
We've also revamped our telework policy because obviously telework works, and we have proof now that telework works. And so we're going to be more flexible, obviously, with allowing people to work from home.
Conversations and questions that will likely change many times over as the workforce prepares to go back in to the office. I'm Stephanie Stone, reporting.
That's it for us, gang. As always, thanks for watching. We'll be back with more In the Loop tomorrow, same time, same place. More top stories from Newsy are headed your way right now.